I'm Eric Orange with Burlington County Parks, and we're back to talk more about Hugh Campbell. Hugh Campbell moved to Mount Holly in 1932. For a while he lived in Hack's Canoe Barn, and after that he lived in Kate's Island Store for a while. But eventually he got his own cabin on Kate's Track and he moved in there. He lived for years and years without running water, heat, or electricity. He had a reputation as being a loner, but he was never really alone. He was always part of the Creek community along Kate's Track. Two of his neighbors were Paul Ferguson and Louis Gessensway. Both played in the Philadelphia Orchestra and lived along the creek during the summers with their families. We're going to go down to Kate's Track along the Rancocas Creek, and we're going to talk to Art Smith again about Hugh Campbell's artwork. And we're actually going to see this place. It's Listen In, home of the Gessensway family for almost 100 years.
Thank you, Eric. Today we're going to look at three more paintings by Hugh Campbell. Today we're going to look at one of his most favorite subjects, which is the Rancocas River and the area around it. And this is an area really close to where he spent a lot of his time and had his studio. So it's pretty fortunate to be where he actually painted. This painting, as Eric introduced it, at first appears to be a very kind of muted, dark painting. But up close and looking deeply at these colors, there's an incredible variety of images, texture, color that Hugh Campbell has put into this painting. One of the things that artists do when we critique work is that we look to see what the artist did, how he did it, and to pull out of that things that we as artists can grow from and learn from and experience in our own art. One of the interesting things about Hugh Campbell is his use of texture and his stroke marks and his working that canvas. Up close, this is very three-dimensional. And of all the paintings that we've looked at so far, this has got the most documentation of brush strokes, of lines being drawn into wet paint by probably the back of his brush. And it's a pretty phenomenal piece. There are greens in here, there are yellows and ochre back here, there's red in here, there's a kind of a turquoise green up here, and he's got different variations of greens here, a lot of browns, dark browns, light browns, and then a little bit of blue in the sky, but a lot of it is that off-white that he's used in other paintings as well. When we talk about rule of thirds in a painting, what we're talking about is that we don't want, as an artist, your image to be smack in the middle of your painting. So if you break it up into thirds, then your painting is more interesting to the viewer and it forces the viewer to look more around through all of the painting, not just at that image that's in the front and in the middle. And that's, again, happens again with this painting, in the sense that you have roads coming in and moving your eye back into this background. The building, which is behind us that he painted, is interesting placed here in such a way that it kind of shoots our eye back down into this road that leads our eye back into here. So we kind of do this loop, which artists oftentimes consciously plan out. The interesting thing about Hugh Campbell is that we can't ask him what he thought. We've got to just interpret what we have left. The trees that he's done here, it is so scratched and scrawled and worked, the branches on top of wet paint, that he's pulling out paint from underneath in kind of a scumbling effect. And it creates this really unique composition that is deceptive at first, and the more you get into it, the more you realize what is in here. Did you see what he did here? He he laid down his initial landscape with his paint, his oil paint down first, and then he came in with most likely the back of his paintbrush or a pencil or something that or a stick that he could then carve and kind of work his way into this painting so that these branches aren't laid down with a brush, but they're laid down by the colors underneath coming out. In some cases he has come back in here and laid down branches with a brush, but there's an awful lot of crossing and digging into the original paint. When we talk about Campbell, one of the things that's interesting about what he's done by painting so much of what he sees at the moment that he sees it is that he puts us in a wintry, a fall type environment. We can see that there had been a rain recently because there are puddles in this road, and his vegetation gives us an indication of what time of the year it is. And the overall composition of this painting is really a unique and interesting interpretation of a style that really incorporates a lot of movement and travel of the brush and the back of his brush in this painting. Now, another interesting aspect of Hugh Campbell's work is that not having a lot of money, he didn't have a lot of money for paint, he didn't have a lot of money for brushes, and he didn't have a lot of money for canvases or surfaces to paint on. And one of the interesting things about this painting is that there is a painting on the back of this painting that we're looking at. A whole different scene, one that he probably didn't like as much as this front one, and chose to do this rather than throw away the canvas. Not all artists do that. It's really interesting that because he was not a moneyed artist, he had to make use of what he had. And that canvas that wasn't that appealing to him forced him to another painting, and this is what we have here today. This is another painting that Hugh Campbell painted on the creek, and we are right on the creek right now. This is different than the painting we just looked at. Whereas the other painting had a lot of texture, a lot of impasto, a lot of scumbling into his work, this painting is very, very flat compared to that. It still has some texture down here in these trees, but for the most part, he is just laying on thin layers of paint and on top of each other and creating his image more in a flat sense than he did in a heavy applied paint sense that he did on the painting we just looked at. Well, what's interesting about this painting is that when he looked at the other painting that he did with branches, and you could tell that he dug into that paint with an object, a stick or the back of his brush. He's done a little bit of that right in here, and he's done a little bit of that right up in here, but not a lot. And it's curious because, again, we don't know a lot about his style in terms of when he did what. If he was experimenting with this here, or if this was something just an accident and he liked it later on. Again, an interesting painting compositionally, that you have the little deck here pulling your eye across like this, the roof line pulling your eye down here, which all forces your eye back to this kind of hint at buildings back in here. It is weighted on this left side more than on the right side, but the fact that your eye pulls back there and that there's something back here really makes it unique and pretty interesting. With a lot of Hugh Campbell's work, you have the feeling that he's working very fast. And when you look at the paint strokes in here, the little bit of blue on top of the roof of this house, the trees back in here that are kind of cut cross with the back of his brush like he did in the previous painting, all makes you think that he's just really laying this paint on in a quick manner as he's seeing it. There's an interesting blues that he gets down here on the bank of the creek. This green that kind of falls over, and then down here some purples and dark browns along the water's edge. The playing off of his reflection in the water mirroring the sky is also quickly done and just hinted at and alluded at, or alluded to. Even up here where his work is really thin, you can see the brush strokes and the paint is just sort of applied quickly and in a hurried manner to capture that image. He spent more time with this house and articulated the roof and the house next to it and the porch much more than he did back here, but all of this implies that there's something back in here. Our eye just moves back there in a really interesting way. And for our last painting that we're going to look at today, we've got a very interesting piece by Hugh Campbell. One of the most important reasons why this is interesting is that we can virtually place where he was when he painted this scene. Oftentimes along Kate's track there were picnics, and so this would document one of those picnics to the house behind us. In front of us is the cabin where Hugh Campbell lived, and it's our belief that he set up his easel outside of his cabin and painted this scene. Another reason why this painting really stands out to us is of the 9 paintings we looked at, this is his most expressive and dynamic use of color. We don't see this kind of color interpretation in his other paintings that we've looked at in this series, and it stands out in marked contrast to that. Turquoise and blue and phthalo green and yellows and pinks, and then the reds and blues and peach colored tones of the people all make this painting really dynamic. He's laid purples into the vegetation. He's got purples up in his off-white clouds. Again, like normal for Hugh Campbell, there's a lot of gesture painting going on, a lot of stroke marks happening, fairly flat in comparison to the first painting we looked at today, but nonetheless, he is moving paint around in a fast and hurried and almost frantic way. We've got an interesting, for him, a long horizontal lead-in to the scene, and then the scene just spreads out in front of us from left to right of people and bicycles and tables and children. Again, something that we haven't seen a lot of in his work to this date. Another interesting aspect of this painting, and when we compare it to the first painting we looked at where he painted on the back of that painting and then flipped it over and painted his second painting, the back of this painting appears to be a ceiling tile. It is rough, has a little bit of paint on it, but it's not something an artist would normally paint on. And it's got a lot of texture to it, and it's probably used, again, because Hugh Campbell didn't have a lot of money for supplies. And so this piece of roofing tile or ceiling tile was available, and he painted on it. Hugh Campbell hasn't dated a lot of his work, so we don't know when he painted this. But one could make an assumption with that some of these colors have a real 70s feel to them. The colors of the bicycles, the colors of the furniture over here. If he is accurately portraying that, that might give us a hint that this was painted in the 1970s. When you look at this painting and you realize the colors in here are marked differently than the colors we've seen before, a couple of things can spring to mind. One is that he has more paint. And in having more paint, he can make more colors. And he's not working from a palette of dark greens and browns and ochres, but he's got some brighter colors that he can add to his palette. Another, and it's again, when you look at artwork from a psychological point of view, this is a much more upbeat painting. It's upbeat, there are people around, the painting just screams sort of a positive attitude and excitement. And Hugh Campbell was really a loner. And one could make a jump that in this cabin that he's lived in by himself out here in the woods for a long time, all of a sudden he's now part of a party. He's part of an event. And he wants to document that, and he's not documenting that event in dark, muted colors, but he's brought out the brightest colors he has in his palette. I think that when I look at it, I think there's an excitement here from the artist in how he's expressing what he's feeling, that this is happy, this is positive, this is something fun. One can even imagine that after he's painted this, he moves into this environment with other people where he can interact. He loved interacting with people, but he didn't do it all that much. There's just something more positive, more upbeat, more personal, less moody, less withdrawn, more gregarious, more outgoing. And it's really interesting that this painting was painted in his backyard. That's what's even more interesting. It wasn't that he just showed up here, he lived out here and saw this going on. One of the interesting things about this painting, that in a gallery you would see this on the wall and you would look at it and you would understand the painting as one of Hugh Campbell's expressions. But here now, with this canvas sitting in between the house that he painted and the house where he lived, gives you a real feeling for who the man was. And it's a different type of experience than looking at a painting on a wall. It gives you a sense of the artist's presence, much more so than when we're in the gallery.